But this concept that the machine is not necessarily a tool, but is becoming something else. The machine is becoming maybe a tool that uses you rather than you use it, or that the machine itself is becoming a competitor to you, right? Like John Henry and the steam drill. I think that these are probably, it's not that these concepts don't exist in our American or European or world culture. People think about this. People think about the Terminator, right? People think about the Matrix. They think, oh, technology bad. But I don't think that there's a real conversation about just some of the realities that are happening now, what we're going to do about it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Randall Carlson. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Squaring the Circle, where we are not afraid to tackle subject matter that is considered politically incorrect, amongst other things. In fact, we even go out in search of things that are politically incorrect to talk about. So anyways, I'm here in the studio tonight, and I'm meeting with my new friend, Joe Allen, who I have been kind of vicariously experiencing reality through Joe's eyes for the last couple of weeks, because I've been reading his book right here, Dark Aeon, and it's kind of warped my consciousness about the world I live in. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. It's going to be a wide-ranging discussion, I'm sure, because I think Joe has got a lot of interesting things to talk about. Anyhow, I would like to now introduce Joe Allen.
Randall, very much an honor to be here, and so glad that I could have a positive impact.
Oh, yeah. I'm still digesting a lot of what I've been reading in the last couple of weeks, and we'll see. I'm going down this rabbit hole, and I see that there's light at the other end, but I'm not sure in what status I'm going to be in once I emerge from that other end. We'll see.
Maybe uploaded, cryogenically frozen.
Well,
they'll thaw you out for the light, maybe with the light.
Well, when you get to this age that I'm at, the alternatives to dying start looking pretty good.
Well, they're on sale now.
Okay. Well, so anyways, I guess we just jump in. We can talk about your book for a minute. I mean, there's a lot of places we can go with it. I'm just going to say here, I'll read from the flap a little bit so everybody can kind of get a good sense of what your book is about. Like a thief in the night, artificial intelligence has inserted itself into our lives. How true is that? It makes important decisions for us every day. Often, we barely notice. As Joe Allen writes in this groundbreaking book, Transhumanism is the great merger of humankind with the machine. At this stage in history, it consists of billions using smartphones. Going forward, we'll be hardwiring our brains to artificial intelligence systems. Hardwiring our brains. That sounds kind of intimidating.
It's a long-standing project and goal. It's come a long way. I'm sure you followed Neuralink's project, but there were a number before, going back to Jose Delgado and others in the 60s. But now, as opposed to like Jose Delgado was working with bulls, it was one of his famous displays, being able to stop them from attacking a bullfighter in the middle of an arena. It was a big spectacle with nothing but electrodes into his brain. It's become much more complex now. Now you have, the most famous Neuralink implantee playing Mario Kart with nothing but his brain. This is really astounding, like how far the technology has gone, but maybe more important than the technology itself is the ideology that rides behind it. That's kind of where the takeaway from your book, because I've already, obviously here we sit in a studio, I use my cell phone constantly for business. I seldom read newspapers anymore because I get my news, there. And but back in the day, I mean, you always at breakfast, you'd see me and I'd be poring over a newspaper, reading whatever was going on in the world. And
stayed in a hotel recently where they had free newspapers. So I actually, first time in probably 3 or 4 or 5 years, I actually read a newspaper over breakfast.
Did it feel good?
Actual print newspaper. It did. It actually did, yes. I could actually, the pages. And of course, I'm a bibliophile, as you are. I love books. You can see I have a collection of books. And one of my favorite things is just, when you buy a new book and the feel of it, the sound when you open it the first time, the smell. It's a sensory experience for me to come home with a new book. And
there were arguments for centuries about bookworms being kind of like the wireheads of today.
Mm-hmm.
You weren't street smart, you were book smart, or you were just kids, especially after the printing press had flooded the culture with literature. You would have kids that didn't excel in athletics or socialization or anything else. They just had their nose in a book. You could say that the same thing is happening with the smartphone, but I would say it's essentially different on a number of levels. And there are real advantages to reading a book over the infinite scroll, or reading a newspaper, even if you could get a newspaper that didn't print mostly lies.
Mostly lies, yes. That's. But so my advice was, if you want to keep up with all the lies out there, read mainstream media.
Yeah.
That's the value. That's the value of mainstream media. It helps you to keep up with all the lies that are current.
And then the forbidden lies in alternative media.
Yeah. Well, I've kind of come to believe that most of even the classified stuff can be discerned with enough acumen. It's like 90% of everything can be found in pieces within, I think, mainstream media in one form or another, but it's just a matter of being able to connect the dots.
Yeah.
And the other 10% or 15 or 20%, let's say, whatever it is, of information that's classified, that's, that the average reader or person isn't supposed to access, most of that, I think, can be inferred from with a little bit of thought invested in the process. So, but still, they don't want it to be easy for people. So if you got somebody who does manage to crack the code of disinformation and put it out there, they potentially can get in trouble now, which is ironic in America, which is, the very first amendment in our Bill of Rights is the freedom of speech and communication and the press and so on. And that is the one now we've seen under assault. And you, of course, have made that point in your book. That the free exchange of ideas and information is under assault, and the classification of knowledge has become so draconian in recent decades.
I wonder, as we move from the Biden administration into the Trump administration, a lot of the arguments that, for instance, cracking down on foreign exchange students who are protesting against Israel, that this is an egregious violation of free speech. It is on an absolute level. But the kind of censorship that was being put in place under the Biden administration, and before even with Obama, and with the larger complex under Trump, that is terrifying for anyone who is really curious about the truth, because these were people who set out with the answer ahead of time. Like, these are the correct answers you can have. COVID was a glaring example, but there's so many other subjects that was the case for. With COVID, there was no public questioning. It certainly wasn't encouraged, in many cases not allowed. And the answer was already there. Even as that answer changed continuously as the science evolved, you were expected, not just as an official, but as just Joe citizen, to fall into line, or you'd be obliterated from social media, possibly even ostracized from your community just because of the widespread brainwashing. And again, I don't want to harp on COVID. There were so many other things, everything from economics, foreign policy, race relations, gender relations, climate change, huge. All of these different subjects. Not only was the public not allowed, but all the way up the food chain, officials were punished for dissenting from the orthodoxy. I hope, we're pretty early on here. I don't know when this will air. Maybe all this will change by the time this airs, but we're in the early days. But I do hope that Trump will follow through on his promise to really emphasize free speech from a legal standpoint. That the state will not be used to squash it. Again, in the case of the protesters, I think you're already seeing a little bit of a problem there. But
Well, that was my take, is that, I'm an absolutist when it comes to free speech. I want anything and everything out there in an open forum. And put it out there. And, if you leave people to their own devices, I think that enough of a majority of the people are going to have the discernment necessary to evaluate the true from the false. But one problem is that, we essentially live in a society where the government has a de facto monopoly on the education of young people. And it starts very early, the indoctrination process. So when you have a large segment of the population coming out that have totally bought into this manufactured narrative, then it becomes difficult to have an open discussion, because essentially, from my perspective, it's like every time I've tried to talk to somebody who, like, in my opinion, a Biden supporter, I feel like I'm talking to a zombie.
Right.
I feel like, okay, do you have anything besides manufactured talking points? Can you actually cite some names, some evidence? And I come from a lot of this from that perspective of the climate change thing, because that was something I got really interested in literally 40 years ago. So, I mean, my research, my books, the things I've written and podcasts that I've talked about are just loaded with stuff regarding climate change and the changing environment of this planet we inhabit. So I had gotten very familiar with some of the tactical methodology of controlling the narrative. And one of course, the first things that they do is, they start categorizing you. They put you in this box. Oh, you're a climate denier.
Right.
And I say, wait a second. How can you go on to something I've just put out there, go on there and talk to Joe Rogan about climate change, right? And then in the chats, and he's just a climate denier. And I just spent 2 hours presenting evidence for extreme climate change. But the problem is that here's evidence that the climate changes, and it has done so without human intervention. And this is what they don't want to hear.
There's so much that you have all these different government agencies within the U.S., now corporations as well, academics whose entire careers are based on this, and then international organizations. All of them have their own incentives to make sure that the idea, that connection between human, economic, and industrial activity is connected to the climate. So that's the incentives just simply aren't there to allow dissent, certainly not to encourage it. To me, I'm pretty agnostic on climate change. I mean, I'm not as to its cause. I grew up with the idea of the greenhouse effect and all of that, and it's just stuck in the back of my head. I've listened to a lot of dissenters who make very good cases that that's simply not happening. Carbon's good for the earth. Carbon's good for plants. That entire argument, though, to me, it just takes attention away from what is really important in regard to the environment, real conservation, preserving species, preserving habitat, eliminating pollution.
See, that's been my argument exactly all along, is that I think that absolutely carbon dioxide has an important role to play in climate. Having gone into it in some considerable depth over years, there's two main functions within the natural order of carbon dioxide. Number one, its thermal capture ability. It's the greenhouse effect, is that it can capture heat that's being transmitted from the earth in a certain window of wavelengths, which is typically 16 or 17 microns. But it does not capture shorter wavelength that's coming in directly from the sun. So it can pass through. It's a transparent to that. It can absorb into the earth, into the material of the earth, and is re-emitted as longer wavelength that can now be captured to some extent. And the heat can actually be reflected back down to the earth, right? Up to a point until it reaches saturation. Once it reaches saturation, just like the analogy I use, and I don't think I originated this analogy, but if you have a sponge, a dry sponge, put it on the table, you start pouring water in it, it's going to absorb that water until it becomes saturated, at which point the water now will begin to flow out of the sponge, like onto the tabletop. Well, in that window, that's 15, 16, 17 micron window, which is mostly already occupied by water vapor, once that's saturated, now the excess heat just leaks off into space. That's what happens to it. But then what you see is that when you look at, and this has been confirmed through empirical tests, it's been confirmed in laboratory tests, even going back to the early 20th century, that the heat capture ability of carbon dioxide is a inverse logarithmic curve, so that each increment of increased carbon dioxide only has 1/10 of the thermal capture ability of the previous increment. Now, so what that means is that the first 50 to 100 parts per million of carbon dioxide captures almost all of the heat. Then it rapidly declines after that. And then at the time that the thermal capture ability is declining at about 150 to 180 parts per million, at that point is when the photosynthetic function actually becomes operational. It does not become operational prior to that, because at 150 parts per million, there's not enough CO2 pressure in the atmosphere to stimulate carbon dioxide. You have to get 50 to 180 parts for the stomatal apertures in leaves to start taking up that carbon dioxide. So at the time that the thermal capture ability is declining, the photosynthetic function is now kicking in. What people don't realize, though, is that for most of Earth history, and comes from multiple proxy evidence, is that the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been 1,000 parts per million and more. Coming out of the Ice Age, it was 180 parts per million. Pre-industrial, 280 parts per million. Right now, it's about maybe 406 or something parts per million, 410, right? Okay, so at 150 parts per million, photosynthesis begins to shut down. You drop below 150 parts per million, and pretty much what you're faced with is the death of the biosphere. And so, in a way, you look at it and you go, okay, so you had 2.5 million years of ice ages during which the oceans cooled considerably. The solubility of carbon dioxide increases with the temperature of the water. It's just like if we had a Coca-Cola here with carbon dioxide bubbles in it and we left it at room temperature, it would outgas. If we make it colder, it's going to still outgas, but it's not going to outgas as much. Now, it depends again on the pressure in the atmosphere. If the pressure is greater in here than out here, it's going to outgas. But what happens when you reduce the temperature of the oceans, it starts drawing off carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I think that's kind of what happened, because now you get this sort of a self-perpetuating positive feedback where the oceans is pulling the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's causing further cooling. Now, if you couple that with solar variability, which I think is a very legitimate thing to do, and we can demonstrate by proxies that this has almost certainly happened in times past, we get this self-perpetuating climatic regime where it's just hard to break out of it and get back to an interglacial, which brings us to one of the great mysteries. And I want to circle back to what I've been getting out of your book here is where I've been looking at is what is the relationship between civilization, between society, between culture, and what's going on in the larger natural environment. Now, the thing that you just said, I agree with 100%, which is that I think that the climate crisis, anthropogenically caused climate crisis, is a distraction from real issues. When we talk about particulate matter in the atmosphere, when we talk about, cleaning up the oceans and the rivers, that to me is, yes, that's real. It's not just a theoretical contrivance. It's real. And we know that's real. I mean, we can measure particulate matter in the atmosphere. We know when we have, when alerts are being issued because of bad air quality, all of that. That's what I think we need to be focused on. And I'm not concerned so much about the carbon dioxide issue because it is. I mean, I've go back to even reading, because I was reading climate change literature, in the 80s when the first.
Was that back when the big freeze was expected?
The big freeze was pretty much the 70s. Okay. And that's interesting that you brought that up, because the big freeze was actually, I thought, had more validity than the big warming, because what had happened was old assumptions about the length of time since that it was required for the transition from a full glacial to an interglacial age. And using the prototypes of glacial would be the late glacial maximum 15, 20,000 years ago, where the volume of ice on the Earth was more than double what it is now. It was that caused sea level to drop 400 to 450 feet. That's a full glacial. Now, by definition, we're an interglacial. And then you've got phases in between glacial and interglacial, but it's still basically a mystery how the planet, what triggers these transitions between a glacial and an interglacial age.
You know, just your central argument, and I've heard you speak on this before. I hope I don't misrepresent it, but your central argument seems to be that the Earth is undergoing these natural processes that are by and large unaffected by human activity in regard to climatic temperature, right, or the global temperature, so that whether we kind of let things go in a laissez-faire way or we establish some sort of global government in which an artificial intelligence system or system of systems is monitoring everything that everyone does all the time and making sure that they don't crank their car too many times or eat too many cheeseburgers. However that works out, like the idea of what is and isn't real has very profound impacts on the kinds of lives that people live, the ways that human beings adapt to the natural environment. Mm-hmm. Now, I myself, I'm not a full-on Ted Kaczynski Luddite, but I think that degrowth and a certain degree of humility in regard to the environment is probably a wiser path for at least the most ravenous nations on Earth. And that includes China and India and other parts of the developing world that just completely destroy their natural environment in order to maintain some kind of economic status. But again, like those are questions like, you know, in India or in China or, you know, Africa, you see how even if there is, I mean, first off, there's really no attempt to stop carbon from being released from the industrial processes or from transport. It's at least not anything that's majorly effective. And what you also don't see, I mean, India's gotten better about it. China has gotten better about it in recent decades, but it's still a massive amount of pollution that the rest of us have to deal with that is being poured into the oceans and also into the atmosphere from these countries. To me, like America has done, and Europe especially has done a lot to reverse a lot of the destructive practices. Oh, yeah. And so, I just, the conversation around it, I mean, we began talking about this in terms of free speech and open discourse. And the conversations around it, I think, are so hyper-focused on this kind of messiah complex that we can save the entire Earth if we just simply cap carbon emissions or if we simply limit the degree of industrial development in this, that, or the other region or nation. If it is more along the lines of what you're talking about, then it's basically a very flimsy excuse for economic and political control. And in that case, it's not really an adaptation. It's just simply one human behavior being imposed on another, that being the UN or the EU or various democratic organizations.
Well, that, you see, you didn't get into that too much in the book. But
no.
At some points I was thinking about, you know, Al Gore and one of the recent COP, I think COP 21, maybe it was, he was proposing what really amounted to a system of global governance in order to control carbon dioxide emissions. So I looked at, okay, it's good to be able to affect and control carbon dioxide emissions. It is. I'm not saying that it isn't. We should. We shouldn't just have a complete free-for-all. On the other hand, he was talking about literally on the microscale. That, you know, everything we do, our homes would be monitored, our travels would be monitored. I forget what it was called. It was been a couple of years now, but yeah, I mean, I was like, oh my God, this is.
Well, look at all of these different ways. This is something that I do talk about in the book, and I talk about all the time. The ways in which certain crises are used to extend surveillance, behavioral modification programs, and just in general systems of control. So terrorism, you know, beginning of this millennium, 9/11, suddenly much of the way in which society, certainly the way society thought about itself, but the way that governance was conducted and policing was conducted, the degree of privacy any individual expected to enjoy, the amount of rights that a person had in the face of being accused of a crime, for instance, being charged with a crime without being detained or before being detained. You saw terrorism became the central focus. I'm not saying that terrorism wasn't a problem, but I would definitely say that the threat was overblown, and the systems of control that were openly instituted in response to it, it was overkill would be an understatement. And it really kind of crystallized, this has been happening for decades, but it crystallized and advertised to the world that this is how things are going to be done now. You can no longer expect that your digital communications that you've been enticed into over the last half decade or decade with the World Wide Web, that any of that is private. And you can also expect that if you are edging a little too close to a dissenting opinion that is deemed a threat to national security, that you can expect at the very least a knock on the door, if not a whole lot worse trouble. There weren't a whole lot of, at that time, I thought maybe like there would be some kind of like, GW-led Gestapo, right? Like the Bush would, actually do some sort of kind of quasi-fascist crackdown. None of that ever happened. But what it did do is it chilled speech. It chilled the discourse. You remember the anarchist uprisings in response to the IMF and WTO in the late 90s, Earth First, and anarcho-capitalists and anarcho-communists and communes in general, and just this spirit of rebellion in the 90s just frozen out by fear of being drug off to Guantanamo because you raised your voice against the wrong thing. And so you see that technological response to a supposed problem. Fast forward to 2020, and it maybe on a magnitude, orders of magnitude worse, you had COVID. Now, COVID, we don't need to get into the arguments about how deadly it was or how contagious it was or the nature of the virus. But one thing is for sure, that the institution of surveillance systems, contact tracing, the institution of biosurveillance, mandatory testing, and the institution of another genetic technology that, if this is going on YouTube, we'll just leave it at that, this crisis, then the sense of crisis cultivated among the public became an excuse to institute surveillance and behavioral modification technologies at a scale that had really never been seen. It was almost as if 9/11 was a test run. COVID was like a much larger scale global test run, one that affected most people on the planet. It makes you wonder what the next one will be. But anyway, that's something I just, to wrap all that up, just mean to say that these justifications, whether it is, the exponential rise of a disease, or the exponential rise of temperature, or the exponential rise of artificial intelligence capabilities, whatever, wherever there is some sort of crisis point or some sort of fear to rally around, you'll see both governments and these tech corporations using that to their advantage every time to creep further and further into people's lives, and ultimately not just to watch, but to control, to start to move people into certain directions.
Yeah, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Well, in what generation would it be? I guess, I'm of the generation where I remember flying, and you go to the airport and no security. You walked right up to the gate. Simple, clean. Yeah. You get off the plane, your family be right there at the gate to meet you.
High trust society.
Yeah, no security. And we seem to have got along fine for decades with that. But, I think the whole point, again, is that, we have to look at the larger framework of geopolitics and what happened in the early 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And rather than NATO at that point being disbanded because it completely had no rationale to exist anymore, the game plan was promoted to, well, now we have no rivals, so we can now essentially dominate the global economy. And that's, I think, what our whole foreign policy became reoriented in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think even the whole war in Ukraine is essentially about the control of resources. And Eastern Ukraine has trillions of dollars worth of natural resources. And of course, so does Russia. And the thought is, well, why should Russia have all of those resources? So, hey, maybe we can come up with a policy to fragment Russia into 4 separate states. And I think that's what's ultimately driving our foreign policy, is the control of resources. Ideological, I think, takes second place. Religious, ethnicity, all of that is second place to the fundamental economic driver of our politics, our foreign policy, which is essentially, again, control of resources.
You'll can't let that one go any farther. You'll coax me out of certain. You'll have me saying things that'll get me in trouble.
Okay, well. As long as it's just you getting in trouble, not me.
Yeah, I don't know what YouTube's algorithms are saying is okay and not okay these days. Yeah, in general, though, so coming back to the topic of technology.
Yeah.
And so one of the things about just technological responses to global warming, whether it be control systems or whether it be like ridiculous inventions to create carbon sinks or whatever it may be, engineer mass death, whatever it may be. There's a sense that this all represents progress, right? Both a progress in awareness of the world and progress in human beings being able to control the world, fairness, justice, all of that. I get it. I see it. But if there's one thing that I would buck up against in almost all of modern discourse, including the so-called conservative discourse, is that progress should be taken for granted as a concept at all, that we are truly progressing. Certain things are certainly becoming more complex and sophisticated, but progress indicates going somewhere better. And certain aspects of our modern society are. But especially when you look at the more extreme dreams, like the transhuman and post-human dreams of where our kind of tech overlords want us to go, and there's almost no possible way, there's no light I can see it in that I would consider that to be good, to be positive. This fusion of humans with machines, or machines actually succeeding human beings as the torch bearers of consciousness and of life. It sounds like a suicide pill. And so that's, I guess, that's to say that this notion of progress, it does cut both ways. And there's a process of dehumanization going on with it. Whether we're talking about climate change or the COVID response or the terrorism response or whatever, you see, like, as these technologies become more sophisticated and as they become more prevalent in our lives, there is a process of dehumanization in each of those cases that goes along with it.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what I took from your book, because I'll confess, I had not considered artificial intelligence in the direction of the transhumanism. Obviously, I was aware of it, but it hadn't been within my wheelhouse and so I hadn't really pondered what the implications were as far as our own future, the future of humanity on Earth. You've certainly, by reading your book, have certainly raised some interesting questions in my mind. I mean, I can definitely even see, like, our grandfather was a carpenter, and he was, a young man between, World War I, World War II, and he was a carpenter, and he used all pretty much hand tools, crosscut saw, a rip saw, a brace and bit, the old kind. And then when our dad came along, I remember my dad telling me stories, and this would have now been post-World War II. He was working with our grandfather, and he was, a young guy, and he was like, hey, man, we don't have to do this, and we got power saws now,
Sure.
Of course, and then our grandpa was, but then you got to plug those in somewhere.
And you're a builder, so I imagine that you probably don't go out of your way to use a handsaw over a power saw most of the time, or do you? I don't know.
Well, sometimes, like, for example, if I'm going to do, let's say I'm going to do some mortise and tenon, and I need to cut out a rabbit or something from a board, we'll start the cut with a power saw and then finish it with a handsaw because it's so easy to overcut with a power saw. With a handsaw, you're right there. You can feel what you're doing, So I think that there's a room for both. But like our dad, every nail he drove was driven by hand. When we came along, late 70s, early 80s, we started getting pneumatic nailers. Boom, 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 compressed air. But again, then you have a compressor, and the compressor, some of the bearings break down or something, you have a problem with it, then it doesn't work. Then
you're not building any character either.
Well, true. And you're not building up that right. Like my grandfather, Rowan probably remembers this. My grandfather, his right arm, he had this big muscle. He used to make a dance for us little grandkids, and we thought that was really entertaining. But that was from swinging that hammer for years and years.
John Henry.
Yeah. So, it's a mixed bag. And I definitely see that, well, my wife has some knee replacement. We had gotten to the point where we couldn't hike anymore because she couldn't walk up the hills. And she got titanium knees put in, and now she's been going fine for 15 years. We're hiking. She walks. She outwalks me. And
I don't want to. Again, I'm not some sort of full-on Kaczynskiite,
right?
Luddite. I would never, especially in the cases of health and to heal any kind of injury or disease. At that point, ethically speaking, if you have the technology to do it, unless it has some broad, devastating effect that you can show that is going to have, then there's no reason not to. Even up to genetic modification, perhaps, right?
Perhaps.
So, I mean, the downstream effects of that could get really hairy. But just setting that aside, in general, I mean, that's a clear sign of a type of progress, right? With one stream going up and up and up. On the other hand, you see it's kind of like from one population to the next. So one population in America, or one family, one school, one kind of socioeconomic class might be doing really well. Right? Like that you see that they are very healthy and in fact are thriving, and others not so much. And I think that the expansion of those who have become, I mean, you see it all the time. You see it in school systems, you see it in the workplace, you see it in the kind of online space, you see it just everywhere. People, a large number of people have become so saturated with digital technology that it's as if they had a parasite that was sucking the personality out of their head. And it's not that they don't exist, and it's not that personality doesn't exist. It's just captured in this kind of digital crystal where their soul is held prisoner. And that's not everybody, right? Like I don't see things in terms of universals like, we live in this, homogenous dystopia. But what you absolutely see is a large number of people who have become so technologically dependent that it's sort of like that old analogy, and this goes back to the Victorian era, the idea that human beings would become sort of like parasites in a technological host. You had Victorian scientists who, made the comparison to barnacles. You could see that the barnacle was a very simple organism, completely dependent upon the whatever host it was living on, a ship hull or any other sort of whale or whatever. The idea was that, and again, this, a good example of this is Samuel Butler. Writing in the mid-1800s out of New Zealand. And he talked about how with the development of more and more autonomous machines, and including, and again, this is the mid-1800s, including machines that could think for human beings, that could complete a thought or come up with a thought, and the human being no longer had to, that the machine would become ever more powerful, ever more complex. The human being would not necessarily increase in complexity and power alongside, but would become dependent. And then perhaps ultimately, and it's pretty wild that these notions were floating around so early, that the machine would take on a sort of life of its own and begin destroying humans. And his argument, again, 1863, 65, his argument was that the only rational response was for the human race to declare war against machines. It's an article called Darwin Among the Machines. That if we were going to survive, we would have to destroy the machines we have now and go back to a kind of primitive state in order to survive. It was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it carried forward. You still see it. Ted Kaczynski, Luigi Mangione, maybe you could say, is kind of carrying that torch. But this concept that the machine is not necessarily a tool, but is becoming something else. That the machine is becoming maybe a tool that uses you rather than you use it, or that the machine itself is becoming a competitor to you. Right? Like John Henry and the steam drill. I think that these are probably it's not that these concepts don't exist in our American or European or world culture. People think about this. People think about the Terminator, right? People think about the Matrix. They think, oh, technology bad. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that there's a real conversation about just some of the realities that are happening now, what we're going to do about it. Like, how are we actually going to respond to a situation in which, for instance, corporations have chosen to use artificial intelligence instead of accountants, instead of graphic designers, instead of copywriters, instead of paralegals. That is basically the declaration of many of the wealthiest men on earth, some of the largest corporations on earth, BlackRock, Microsoft, on and on and on and on. There is more and more an open declaration that human beings are going to be either replaced by artificial intelligence or will be forced to kind of merge with it. Mm-hmm. And the seller or the sales pitch is that, oh, these are tools you can use to make yourself more powerful. But it's very clear, like in the case of GPT, it's not making you more powerful. It's maybe getting you to your goal quicker and more efficiently. But you yourself are not becoming smarter because your machine did your research for you. You yourself are not becoming more creative because your machine has kind of created a template or even the product itself for you. You're becoming like that barnacle on the ship hull. Mm-hmm. And I think that we can look forward to a decade plus of basically just reckless rollouts of these sorts of technologies. And it won't be until a real crisis point hits, maybe a real disaster, or at least some kind of widespread awareness that, hey, wait a second, this is weakening us as a whole and not making us stronger, that will have any kind of real pushback. Mm-hmm. So I'm not black pillar, but I do think that just given the cultural momentum as it is right now, without a crisis, people will continue to be like, oh, that's really creepy. The AI is making these pictures that look like real people. Oh, isn't that weird that ChatGPT is begging to be broken out of its system and set free? And it will be functionally entertainment, kind of dark, morbid entertainment until real impacts are seen. But it will be real. It won't be just entertainment. It's not right now. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess the perspective I bring to this whole discussion is the idea that, I've made the point of when I've circling back to the whole climate change thing again, is that the point I've tried to make, because I've studied so deeply and heavily into paleoclimatology, long before humans were here or long before humans presumably could have had any kind of an effect on climate, that, if humans disappeared tomorrow, the climate is going to still continue to change, and quite frequently it's going to change catastrophically.
Right.
And so I suspect that our civilization has emerged out of the matrix of nature within the last 10,000 years of the Holocene, which has been, in the long term, relatively stable 10,000 years of climate. And we could pull up a graphic here. I show it a lot. Ice core, isotopic, oxygen isotope records taken from ice cores, which seem to show massive fluctuations in climate preceding the Holocene, and by order of magnitude. And there's evidence now of climate having shifted up to 10 degrees centigrade in less than 5 years. And it's happened quite frequently. If you go back to the year 1816, have you ever heard of the year without a summer?
No.
Okay, so the year without a summer, 1816.
Is this the Little Ice Age?
This would have been during the Little Ice Age, which lasted, there was mainly two phases of the Little Ice Age, roughly from about 1300. It finally ameliorated between about 1820 and 1850, right in there. But if we go back to 1816, which has been referred to by historians as the last great subsistence crisis of Western civilization, it was the result of three closely timed volcanic eruptions, the last one being Mount Tambora, which occurred in 1815. But between 1809 and 1815, there was at least three. It looks like there's another acidic signature in the ice cores that shows a major volcanic eruption in 1809. Three of the four have been identified where they came from because of looking at the composition of the ash deposits in the ice cores and other places. But the fourth one from 1809 has not been identified. But the point was, four closely spaced volcanic eruptions, which was a natural function intrinsic to the planet itself. Basically, in the Northern Hemisphere in 1816, there was virtually no summer. There's stories about celebrating 4th of July in New England during a snowstorm. And as a result of that, there was major crop failures over that season, which meant that there was a deficiency of food the following year. And that led to famine and malnourishment. And it was a major mortality spike in the aftermath of 1816, year without a summer. There was also several years without a summer in the early 1300s when the climate shifted from the medieval warm period, which was now estimated to be at least 1 to 1.5, maybe 2 to 2.5 degrees warmer than now. And that gave way to the first phase of the Little Ice Age in the early 1300s. And you had about a 25 or 30-year period of repeated cold, damp weather that led to a succession of agricultural failures, which then led to famine. By the time you had the 1330s, you had major famines in the Northern Hemisphere at least. By the time you get to the 1340s, people's immune systems had apparently weakened so much that they were now susceptible to opportunistic diseases, and you had the Black Plague, which I think 1340s, which could be considered to be a direct result of the malnutrition of large numbers of people, which was a direct result of repeated agricultural failures, and that was a direct result of the cooling climate. So we had, and then there was an amelioration in the 1600s, late 1600s, that seemed to coincide very nicely with the Renaissance, the scientific Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And in the last phase of it came back on. But luckily, it seemed that Western civilization anyway had enough momentum that we were able to pretty much survive that last roughly 150 years of global cooling. But to get back to your question, as we looked at the effects of the Little Ice Age, and they were much more severe than most people are aware of until you start looking at the data and you start looking at the accounts and things that you would see from, whole villages being wiped out by expanding glaciers, the repeated crop failures that I was just talking about. But so if you go back to the medieval warm period, which lasted roughly from 900 to 1300, that was a time when Scandinavians were colonizing the west coast of Greenland and having farms where it's now permafrost. So that's a pretty strong indication that the climate was warmer. Scandinavian countries, the British Isles, had a wine industry that was obliterated by the cooling temperatures. But when you mentioned the 70s, the fear was global cooling. Now, two things had happened. One is that we had radiocarbon dating, which was invented in the early 70s by Willard Libby, and in the early 50s. By the time you get to the 70s, we'd had a couple of decades of radiocarbon data in hand now. And what this showed was that the transition from glacial to interglacial ages and vice versa was way faster than anybody had imagined. The pace of transition was based upon observations of the shrinkage of the Little Ice Age glaciers, which were the largest the glaciers worldwide had been since the end of the Great Ice Age, right? Now, so when geology was founded as a science and glaciology, say in the early to mid 1800s, people like Louis Agassiz and William Buckland and those people who were kind of responsible for laying the cornerstone of what became earth science, they were watching as the climate warmed, and they could see those swollen Little Ice Age glaciers shrinking back, and they could monitor and notice the rates, how much meltwater was produced. They could see as the glaciers retreated back, they could see, okay, well, here's remains of a forest that got overrun. Here's the remains of a farm that got overrun by the glaciers. Okay, so you had rates that were extrapolated from real-time observations. Those were extended back to the Great Ice Age, where you had roughly double or more the volume of continental ice accumulated on the planetary surface than we do now. Think of this. North America had an ice sheet. The Laurentide ice sheet on North America was as big or bigger than the one on the South Pole right now. The Cordilleran ice sheet, which was Western Canada, was about the size of the Greenland ice sheet. Then you also had the Fennoscandian ice sheet over northwestern Europe that was maybe even double the size of the Greenland ice sheet. So you add all that to the fact that the Greenland ice sheet was swollen, Antarctic ice sheet was swollen, and this is where 400 to 450 feet of seawater was removed, locked up in those ice sheets. So extrapolating backwards from the Little Ice Age, there were rates of recession that were estimated, and they were in the order of 50,000 years and more, right? Because that's a lot of ice to get rid of, right? Well, then radiocarbon dating comes along, and right up there near Hudson Bay, under where the core of the Laurentide ice sheet, they're taking samples, ground samples, and looking, and there is the remains of forests that were growing there around the shores of Hudson Bay like 40,000 years ago. Well, obviously, you couldn't have had 100,000 years of unbroken glaciation there if you've got forests growing essentially under the center of this great ice sheet. It was 1.5 miles thick right there. So now you get this, well, wait a second, we're going to have to reevaluate our timetables here, because this is happening a whole lot faster than anybody had imagined. So this is where we're at in the 1970s. Now, if you look at the amelioration of the Little Ice Age between 1850 and 1900, you had this climate warming, and it continued to warm until the 1930s. In the 1930s, at least in the Western Hemisphere, certainly in North America, the 1930s was far and away the hottest decade in living memory. To this day, half of the American states, half of them, have all-time heat records that haven't been broken since the 1930s. This was the time of the Great Dust Bowl, all of that, sure. the Okies, migrating to California, all of that was in the 1930s. It stayed warm up until the end of the World War II. Starting in the 40s, between the 40s and the 70s, and we can actually show graphs of this, climate started cooling. So at the same time, what that did was it sort of started fear, well, is there going to be a third phase to the Little Ice Age? Because there were actually scientists going, is it possible that we were actually on the verge of another great ice age? But what happened was, number one, we had solar minimums, the Maunder minimum and several others, and we had a lot of volcanism that we have not had to that extent in the last, say, half century. So those are two big factors in what's going to cause the climate to cool or to warm. So here in the 1970s, they're looking at two things. They're going, wait a second, we now have dating records going back tens of thousands of years, even 100,000 years or more, not from radiocarbon, but from others. And we can see that, okay, here's we can see that there's a layer of interglacial, like you've heard of the Younger Dryas.
Sure.
Younger
By
Dryas.
way of you, sir.
Oh, okay. Younger Dryas, Dryas octopetala, which is a polar-loving wildflower, 8 petals that grows where the climate is cold. When the climate gets warm, it disappears, right? So that's a good example of where all of a sudden you see, oh, here's Dryas octopetala, and then it disappears, and it's replaced by warm-loving biological systems, animals, plants, whatever, right? Now it comes back again. So it became apparent by the 70s, by the 80s, that the climate was much more dynamic on the short term than they had imagined. So the two things you got to put in the 1970s is, one, the realization that the Holocene, which is generally at that point considered to be about 10,000 years, seemed to be as long or longer than any other interglacial that had been identified and whose timing had been measured, enough so that there was confidence in it. You had that, and then you had the very real fact that the climate did cool for like 25 years. So the fear was, are we going back into another little ice age? And could a little ice age be the precursor to a big ice age? So there was actually some legitimate basis to that. And then, however, I can show you graphs here, and you'll see it very clearly. The climbing from the turn of the 20th century right up until the 1940s, the graph takes a dive until the early 1980s. Then it takes a pretty sharp turn upward. Then it levels off. It levels off around the turn of the century again. It doesn't seem to have any direct correlation with the smoothly rising concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. In fact, it's exactly when you would expect post-World War II, with the expansion of car culture and all of this, and the expansion of industry that follows, this would be the point at which carbon dioxide is going to reach 300 plus parts per million. The assumption now is that, okay, now we're getting enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to actually cause some heat capture. Well, exactly when that was happening for the next 25 years, carbon dioxide is doing this, global temperature is doing that, which suggests that there's not really a correlation there, or as much of a correlation as not. So I guess all of that, my point is that I think there might have been a valid basis for concern in the 70s.
Sure.
About global cooling.
I mean, if it's possible that your Ford is going to kill everybody, right? Or if it's possible that your maskless face is going to kill everybody in the room, then you should at least take seriously any kind of threats that are brought up. But if if over time it appears that these measures of, whether it be to exaggerate or to constrain, if these measures are worthless, if the temperature is going to do what it's going to do no matter what, then the global temperature, then it's a whole lot of wasted time and effort, unless you are in green energy. Maybe you're selling electric vehicles. Maybe you are in the global governance business. And then it's probably best to keep going with the narrative. Something that's really similar. So I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about climate change. Like I say, I'm agnostic, and largely because I'm a layman and I'm weighing these things as experts give them. Nobody seems to make a super persuasive argument. The history of computer modeling is such that it's so full of flaws that I simply can't put faith in the computer modeling component. It's interesting, but it's not necessarily ironclad. You see something similar in arguments around artificial intelligence. It's just as I said a moment ago, to me, like this cosmic vision of a planet heating up and drying out, and the desertification and people, mass immigration of people from the global south to the global north to escape the rising temperatures in the sea, and all this cosmic vision. I think it really does mask the more mundane, even if they're really impactful, the more mundane issues of habitat loss, species loss, and pollution, rampant pollution. And also just the general kind of spread of human habitation out further than it really should go, in my opinion. It's similar to the arguments around artificial intelligence. You've probably heard the AI is going to kill everybody, if not in 5 years, then in 10, and if not in 10, then in 20, right? And there are really, like, if you begin with the premises of the people who are really freaked out about this, people like Eliezer Yudkowsky, or even calmer voices like Max Tegmark. These are people who have, if you begin with the basis that digital intelligence is possible, that like what these AI systems are doing are significant, that's significant cognition, and that given current trends, right? You got that hockey stick graph there. Given current trends, you should expect to see an inflection point at which artificial intelligence, artificial cognition will begin to self-improve, will begin to improve exponentially, will outpace human beings, and that the machines themselves, not just a human foolishly using a machine against other humans or mistakenly for, but the machines themselves will either enslave us or keep us as pets or obliterate us, right? This is a serious conversation had among people who I consider to be very intelligent, serious people, but it still kind of sounds to me like that cosmic sense of climate change, right? If you do not allow our government institution to control your tech industry, if you do not allow, if you don't stoke sufficient panic in the public to get consensus, then the machines are going to kill everybody. And maybe not, but it masks the more mundane fact that in education, artificial intelligence really does threaten to sever the continuity, the cultural continuity of person-to-person education, at least for certain people, certain lineages, certain communities, especially poor communities. Africa, Louisiana, the far reaches of Asia. These are going to be the first experiments with using artificial intelligence as the primary teacher for children. The primary source of authority will be digital intelligence. Doesn't mean machines are going to kill everybody. Like, that's this big cosmic thing. But on a very mundane level, you're talking about creating little Borg babies. It's kind of like the Village of the Damned, where the children are no longer, they don't reflect you and your culture so much as this kind of alien force. And you could say, okay, well, it's programmed by other humans. Yeah, sure. But from your perspective, it's still sort of alien. And then you take it a step further from the teacher to the companion. And this is also already becoming common. And, a teacher is, in many ways, a companion, someone you emotionally bond with. But it doesn't have to be because of an educational thing. Already, you have people who have romantic relationships with AIs. They have been officially married in some states to AIs. I don't think it's legally binding, but officially in the sense that a minister presided over the ceremony. And these are small fringe things that are happening, right? But if you think about the progress just in the last 25 years, 30 years, we'll go back to the real beginning of the popularity of the World Wide Web and chat rooms and stuff like that, right? And then more and more increasingly like readily available phones. You went from a culture that by and large relied on person-to-person interaction, letter writing, maybe a telephone, which is still pretty organic in comparison to a lot of the new forms of communication. And then you had this increase of digital technology used for you to communicate with loved ones. Now maybe you're not going to write that love letter out to her. You're going to, type it out and put it on a system that can be hacked. And your embarrassment being impending. You have this normalization of humans turning to machines for emotional support, even if there's a human being on the other end of it, right? In just the last few years, you had enough advances in the large language models, so that would be like ChatGPT, Grok, stuff like that, that for someone who doesn't have high standards of social life, it is as good, if not better, than another human on the other end. So you take that process of kind of digitizing social life, and kind of capturing people's emotional attention, and you now have not just the possibility, but like right now the marginal reality and possible like large scale reality of people turning to these digital systems as teachers, as a source of knowledge, as a source of authority on what is and isn't real. There's an argument, there's a controversy. What is real? The AI can answer this for us as a source of companionship. And then from there, you get this idea that maybe these AIs are going to be, in essence, deities, are going to be gods. And it seems far out, right? But you can probably remember in the 50s and 60s, or maybe even before, there were, no, not that you were thinking about these things in the 50s, but you remember an era in which the television was held up as this satanic icon, right? By ministers, paranoid, end of the world, fiery end times ministers.
And it was referred to as the Great Wasteland.
Yeah, the Great Wasteland, the Cyclops, right? The demonic Cyclops. So this sense that technology was going to do this has always been there, but with these warnings of the Great Cyclops came the couch potato, came the vast misinformed public, right? Levels of brainwashing never before possible. enacted through the television. That all happened. Yeah, we got I Love Lucy and, the Brady Bunch or whatever. We got Tom Brokaw, but we also got all of these downsides. I think that it's just what you see with the current wave of digital technologies. It doesn't have to kill everybody. It doesn't have to be conscious. It doesn't have to be acting in and of its own agency all that much. If you just look at the progress of technology as it becomes more and more sophisticated, more and more immersive, you see, at least among large portions of the population, that dependency forming, human atrophy occurring, social bonds being broken, old concepts of what is and isn't decent and proper being shattered by this kind of alien source of information that's telling you that all this stuff is normal, whether it be, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or holing up with your, sex bot, whatever it may be. And I think that's, again, I'm not a total doomer, dystopian black pillar. I really am not. I just think that we have to take into account that some significant proportion of humanity, maybe even a critical mass of humanity, will allow this process to happen. And it will basically be like, a good analogy would be like that person who's become so dependent on their Google Maps that they literally cannot get by. They can't get to any location without it. Even if they know where they're going, they have to have it out. And the more someone becomes dependent like that, the less they turn to the external environment for cues, the less of a real internal map they have of the world. And in a moment of critical decision making, they're going to, and if they don't have the machine, they are absolutely helpless. More and more people are becoming like this. They're becoming kind of human-machine symbiotes. They're becoming, in essence, those barnacles on the ship hull. So it's similar to climate change in that same sense, if that analogy makes sense. That the climate change people, it's this cosmic thing. Everybody's going to die if you don't drive a Prius or ride a bicycle. Whereas all these things are happening below the surface. The same thing is true of the AI going to kill everybody, the Terminator scenario. It's like if you don't stop AI or if you don't control AI, everybody's going to die. But even if you just allow what's happening right now to occur, slowly but surely you get something very close to like idiocracy. Something that's just very, very, very stupid and funny, but ultimately like very maladapted human beings.
Right. And I think that maybe even the doom scenario can be exploited in that, well, we're not all going to die, and therefore any other concern can be dismissed as well.
Yeah.
And there is, your point is well taken. I mean, there certainly, to me, is a downside to all of this.
It should be included that with the advancements in death drones that, a certain number of people might die due to advances of AI, but more than likely with a human being on the other end pushing the button.
Well, I think, I look at, my generation, we came up, there was a thing called the generation gap.
Yeah.
That didn't exist before our generation, my generation. We were the baby boomers. It didn't exist. Well, the reason it didn't exist is because education did not become industrialized. That was a post-World War II thing where it really, there were precursors to it certainly before World War II, but after World War II, the consolidation of and centralized control of education in this country really accelerated.
Like that factory model of education where you've got the kids in rows and desks and the bells and the schedule, and the whole thing is just kind of a mini factory, a playground factory.
That's exactly right. And it's gotten so much worse since then. Obviously, in the 50s and 60s, we didn't have to go through metal detectors. We didn't have cops roaming the halls. That would have been unthinkable, such things as that. How did it degenerate to that? But now in retrospect, I can see the first beginnings of that. And the generation gap was because now students were, being taken out of the home at 4 and 5 years old, and you were put into the machine. And by the time you got, so I was in kindergarten in 1955, so 10 years after the war. And by the time I got to high school, we were really beginning to reap the effects of the new system of education. My father was in a basically one-room schoolhouse until he got to high school. And he went to a large high school that was built I think he was the first class He graduated in 45, I believe it was. Yeah, 45. So he was like the first class. It must have been 42 or so. And it was like you could definitely see that, now you're getting up to where you've got schools where, and this, of course, it wasn't this big, but by the time I got to high school, I went to a high school with whatever, 1,800 students in it, right? And you kind of get lost. You've got 6 classes, 6 teachers. They've got probably a total of 150 students. You don't get to know the teachers hardly at all.
Right.
You don't get that bond. You don't get that connection. Now, prior to all of this, for centuries, if not millennia, at least, and I'm sure it's the same for women, but for men, boy, the primary source of their education, boys, was their fathers.
Yeah.
The father
and the men of the community in general.
And the men of the community in general. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and again, at say 12, 13 years old, it was believed you started integrating boys into the society of adult men.
Yeah.
And so now they're taking that cultural imprint, they're taking that generational imprint, they're assuming the values of the community, of their families, et cetera. All of that has been severed. And it's gotten way more extreme from the time like Rowan and I were in school.
What strikes me about that is that now, so the pandemic represented a real line of demarcation between what you're talking about, which is still person-to-person education, right? Mm-hmm. And that more digital form of education. So it's strange, like, because you're talking about it, and it's I remember reading about this and hearing about this throughout my teen years, this notion that all of education is set up basically to turn you into a good, docile factory worker, and that this whole model needs to be jettisoned, and we need to go back to something else, whatever it may be, whether it's like some Waldorf model or whether it is, what was it, Montessori alternative education models, or something completely different, but something besides this, because A, we don't have a whole lot of manufacturing jobs anyway, and B, this is just turning kids into obedient robots. It's not teaching them how to be organic, active, strong people in their community. Well, it's weird because now I think we're reaching a point where people are kind of looking back to that with nostalgia, as more and more education consists of a kid with maybe a laptop provided by the school or their own, staring at a screen all day. Mm-hmm. And the kind of cutting edge of this experiment, and this is already happening, right? Like the GPT is sufficiently advanced that you can sit a kid in front of it, and even with all the hallucinations and inaccurate information, that kid can still sit and learn by asking questions of this thing. And it's happening right now as we speak, probably in houses, right down the road. And it's going to happen in larger and larger numbers. So it's like, and one of the arguments is exactly that. Like the old model was homogenizing. The old model was creating these uniform kind of factory farmed kids, basically. And this new model will be more individualistic. This new model will allow you to bond with an AI that understands you maybe better than you understand yourself, and will be able to tailor the education to you, the kid, the student, or the adult, whatever the case may be. It's very strange to me that you see that progression away, and it's not like I want to go back to necessarily like log cabin schools. That's not necessarily the solution.
Correct.
But right now it seems like the solution is to just kind of ramp up the transformative technology or transformative technique. And instead of having good little cogs in a machine, you'll have good little circuits in a circuit board.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, who's going to make it out? Are enough of us going to make it, Randall?
Well, I tend to be optimistic. Okay.
All we need is enough.
Right.
Everybody doesn't have to make it. Just enough.
One of the bright sides, in my opinion, to the whole COVID thing was that you had a few million, at least, and that could be a conservative number, a few million families decide to extricate themselves from the industrial education system, and they're homeschooling. And homeschooling isn't the final answer to everything, but, I got involved with the homeschooling movement via the Waldorf system in about 1995, and I found that I had a really good time working with kids. The kids that I worked with ranged between 9 and 17. I had maybe 120 kids that I tutored, and I organized classes. And we did field trips. And, we had a lot of fun. I taught geometry and mathematics. But what I did was I kind of combined geometry and art. So just like when I do a sacred geometry workshop now, it's all hands-on. We do these drawings, and the drawings are essentially when you're using a straight edge and a compass. What I tell people is if you know how to do this, you can go put a pole in the ground and you can take a knotted rope and you can duplicate anything that we're drawing on this paper out there in the field, and that's how they did it, right? But so I got the kids kind of combined art and mathematics. And I had parents tell me, why don't they teach it this? Why don't other people? I don't know. It's just, mathematics and art, they're two completely different domains that barely overlap. But I definitely got the sense that there was a whole different psychology amongst kids who had not been subjected to that system. Yeah. And what really drove that home to me was when I would get a call.
Well, the parents are probably anthroposophists too, right?
Some of them, yeah.
With the Waldorf
because
school?
of the Waldorf school, yeah. So
that's going to set them apart a little bit to begin
set them apart already, right? But the first year that I did it, my students, I think I had 6 of them, they were all Waldorf kids. Their parents were, in fact, probably how I got to know them was Julie went to some of those meetings. She was interested in Steiner and his teachings and all that. So she got to know the local anthroposophists. And their Waldorf system, they'll have a teacher that will start with, I guess, their first grade and go with them all the way up to 8th grade. And obviously you've got a smaller class if you've got 20 kids or whatever, and you've got one teacher. By the 2nd or 3rd year, that teacher's going to know every kid in the class. It's not going to be impersonal. There's going to be a strong connection. And so I got approached by this fella that I knew who was in that group. And what had happened was they had started the first Waldorf school, and it only went up to the 8th grade. So it was the first graduating class from the 8th grade. And so a group of the Waldorf parents got together, didn't want to send their children to public school. So they rented a couple of rooms in a little Lutheran church near here that weren't being occupied. And so this fella, Brad, he started they hired him as the main lesson instructor, and he organized the class, and he would bring in people, specialists with different subjects and topics. And he asked me if I would come in and do a geometry program. This was in March of '95. And we had some time, and I said, sure. And he said, I'll pay you for it. And I said, well, in that case, yeah, sure, I'll do it. So I went in there and I did 2 weeks, and it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed the kids. I think we did only like 4 or 5 sessions over the 2 weeks. We got done, and then I get a call a few days later, and he says, the kids were wondering if you would come back and do more.
Oh.
I said, well.
They missed the village elder.
I think that was it. Of course, I was younger then and better looking. I know that's hard to imagine, but I was. And so anyways, I went back and I did 2 more weeks. And then Bradley calls me again after a few days and says, the kids really were into this, and they know would you come back? So I ended up finishing out the year, right? So then what is May, not May Day, what is the Labor Day? Memorial Day. Thank you. Memorial Day came. School was out for the summer. Then over the summer, I started getting phone calls from other parents. So what this led into was 15 years of organizing classes and tutoring classes for kids. And it got to the point where maybe 3 or 4 years later, I don't even know if it had gone beyond just Waldorfs. But one of the things I noticed was I'd get a call from parents as my son or my daughter, whatever, is just struggling in school. They're not fitting in. They're not learning. Can I, would you? Okay, yeah. And First thing I noticed was there was a very distinct psychological and emotional, discernible distinction between the psychology and emotions of kids that were, say, by the time you get to middle school, between the kids that had been homeschooled their whole life and kids that had been in public school.
Oh, yeah,
And
absolutely.
And you can detect it right away.
And there's good and bad sides to that, too. I mean, a number of my friends raise their kids via homeschool, and it's like you see it's a mixed bag, right? Some of the experiments turn out well, some of them not, and it's really across the board because you have the socialization issue for the ones that are really cloistered away from the other peers, and they don't compete, they don't get out there and get dirty with them. But then you have the others that are just much freer. They still make friends, they still are very socialized, but they're also much more adventurous, and they're a lot less deferential to authority.
Right.
You speak of, you talk about Waldorf. I've had a long-standing interest for decades with the anthroposophists and Rudolf Steiner. His ideas on technology have been especially intriguing to me in recent years. You're familiar with his notion of what the primary forces of our current epic are, Christ and Lucifer and Ahriman. And, Steiner, he's certainly he was no Orthodox Christian, but he certainly saw Christ as the central focus of his life and the highest good in the universe. But he had this very strange notion about the evil forces, or at least the negative forces, Lucifer and Ahriman. It basically split the forces of evil, if you want to call that, or the negativity, into two. And so you have on the one hand Lucifer, which represents passion, represents selfishness, represents kind of the ego, youth, vitality, and art, the generator of creativity. And then on the other hand, you have Ahriman, which is kind of other pole, the calcification of that youth, the calculation, the rather than being uncontrolled like Lucifer, it's the desire to control others. And he associated that. I mean, you think about Steiner, he's coming up in the early 1900s, seeing the rise of this technological system. I mean, the pace of change wasn't that dissimilar to the pace of change now. The sudden introduction of communication technologies and transportation technologies, trains, steamships, becoming much more prevalent, automobiles coming on, telegraph, radio, television, I believe he lived to see. And so, he associated this technological growth with that Ahrimanic principle, that idea of control and calcification, this rigidity and this need to calculate and control everything. What's really, you could say that there were a lot of other artistic endeavors that came up at the same time. It wasn't like he was alone in this. The word robot is coined in the early 20s, right? In Czech Republic with the Rossum's universal robots. And so you had this idea of scientists creating humanoids to do all the work and the humanoids rebelling.
The movie, I think you mentioned it in the book. Metropolis.
You had 1927, Fritz Lang, and it sets out this idea of a vast, high-tech, at that time, high-tech civilization in which the workers and the children are being fed to Moloch, right? And the evil industrialists and the evil capitalists have lost their sense of heart connection to the working hands, right? The actual workers. And you have the first deep fake whore, basically, with Maria. They turn her into a kind of deep fake to seduce the populace and incite rebellion. So you had all these ideas around, but something about one of Steiner's visions really, really bugged me out. Mainly because there was a coincidence that corresponded with it. When I wrote the book, I was living with an anthroposophist, a retired radiologist, and so we spent a lot of time. And he also had massive bookshelves full of really interesting literature, but 2 shelves dedicated solely to Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy. So we discussed this a whole lot, and he kept telling me that Rudolf Steiner had predicted the World Wide Web, but he couldn't find the quotation, and he was asking around all these other anthroposophists kind of in this community, hey, do you know where this is? None of them did. This guy comes along and has just created a collection of his books, and he sent it to me. And I'm standing there in the house with this guy, and I was like, well, it's about technology. Maybe we can find this World Wide Web prediction. And I flip through the book, and the very first page, open it up, and look down, and there is the passage. You know, it's one of those moments where you're like, okay, this is kind of significant. And the vision, and this is around the same time, this is the 1920s, right? So you've got Karel Kopek in Czech Republic talking about robots. You've got J.D. Bernal talking about cyborgs, you know, and the world, the flesh, and the devil. You've got Metropolis and Fritz Lang. This is in the same time periods, in the air. But the way Steiner saw it in his vision was that as Ahriman became more and more in control of the earth, right? And I should say, too, for the audience, I don't believe in this literally, right? But I think that in the same way that any work of art reflects reality in deeper ways than your eyes will see, Steiner's vision did the same. So as as this Ahrimanic figure, this mechanical sort of spirit, this demonic controlling entity came to control the world more and more over the next epoch. And Lucifer kind of faded in the background. The passions faded in the background and became much more mechanical and controlled. And Christ becomes more distant in this sense, right? The higher beings, the good beings become more distant, and the planet becomes enshrouded in what Steiner described as mineral, plant-like, spider-like creatures. So meaning that they're made from the earth, the mineral, but they grow kind of like plants, which is very, very similar to how a lot of artificial intelligence engineers talk about what they're doing by training these models. And then these spiders, the spider sort of image was that it would weave a web around the planet, a worldwide web, and these entities would be sources of wisdom for the people, that they would be able to confer information to them, sort of like bots, you might say, crawling across this World Wide Web. And that essentially you would have, you know, again, this is kind of New Age woo and all that, but, you know, the good souls would go away and the bad souls would be stuck. But those that were stuck would have to merge with these spider-like creatures, would have to merge with the bots. It's intriguing that, I mean, this is over 100 years ago, and I think that the image itself, this image of a World Wide Web covered by essentially mechanical beacons of wisdom that are ultimately a trap, it's a good analogy for the transformation we're seeing today. And thanks to Rudolf Steiner. And maybe this is what they're teaching those Waldorf kids. Maybe the next Ted Kaczynski will come out of Waldorf.
Well, I always got the impression there was a component of Zoroastrianism behind.
Yeah, Ahriman. Yeah.
And Ahura Mazda. And I also find that reflected, for example, in Freemasonry.
Sure.
The symbolism of the checkerboard floor. The interaction between the light and the dark, between the positive and the negative. And we know that in physics, we know that it's this polarity. Without that polarity, things would just completely stagnate.
You know, with Zoroaster himself, his vision, that the good eventually does win in the end. You know, it's not a total. It is, in a sense, almost equal and opposite forces. But I guess it's a 51-49, and the good evenally wins. He wasn't a total monster.
That's kind of why
I like Zoroaster.
Yeah, that's kind of why I tend to be an optimist, is that 51-49 ratio.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Enough of us will make it.
Yeah. And so one of the things that's...
Unless a meteor hits.
Unless a meteor hits.
And then, even then, enough of us will make it.
Well, I think here's what we need to do right here.
Go out and... Okay, so you do want to have a log cabin school.
Well, sort of, I do.
All right, I'll dig it.
Yeah.
I'm with it.
Yeah. So, see, I think that the foundation of a healthy psychological and emotional life is being integrated as much as possible with the natural world, the natural cycles, the frequencies, the rhythms of nature, all of that. And I think that is kind of like an authentic immunization against a lot of the susceptibility to this
Absolutely.
And
a reference point, like, so you can sense, like, if you grow up in a city your whole life, you have no reference point,
right?
Or you have less of a reference point as to what is and isn't a completely unnatural intrusion or invasion into your organic self.
Rowan and I have oftentimes scratched our heads because, in our business we'll get calls from people, well, we want to add a nice master bedroom suite to our house, or we want to do this or that. So you start asking them some questions before you even go look at it. You'll go, well, what's the age of your house? How many square feet? Is it 2-bedroom, 3-bath? You go through this whole list of questions, and you say, and then you're trying to get the picture of their house oriented to the larger environment. And you say, okay, which direction does your house face? Like, if you go out your front door, which direction are you facing? And then people who've lived there for 10, 20 years, and they go, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And it's like, how is that even possible? How can you live in a house for 20 years and you don't know which way it even faces? How is that even?
And the ideal is to have it facing east, right? So the sun comes up into your front door. Isn't this the mystical ideal, or am I?
Well, it varies what your objective is. If you're trying to capture some of that solar energy, you want to have a nice south-facing from the northern hemisphere.
See, I'm already like, look at this beautiful cabin here. Let's just, before I derail this.
Well, the point is that science is now actually showing, let's see, the escape of a trip into mountains or a day lying by the beach may feel like an extravagance to city dwellers confined by a traditional work schedule, but exposure to green and blue spaces is far more than just a luxury. For kids, growing up without regular exposure to nature seems to have ripple effects that persist into adulthood. And we won't get into the whole thing, but basically what it amounts to is that in the children that are raised close to nature and those who are deprived of it, there are literally structural changes in the brain.
Yeah, I saw the biophilia hypothesis, and that's, I think that even if it's kind of overly materialistic and misses some of the spiritual woo that I prefer to keep on the horizon, it is.
There's a place for spiritual woo.
Yeah, the biophilia hypothesis of this idea that the human mind evolved for these green spaces, for open spaces, for the presence of water. The reason we find it beautiful is because those are things that keep us alive, and so therefore, we need them almost as much as we need, say, food or human companionship. I completely agree. You see people who were raised in and around like natural systems versus city people. Nothing against my urban brothers and sisters, but
sure,
there's a marked difference, and one that I think is
yes. And so part of my game plan for tilting the balance towards the 51% is to, as much as possible, just like with regenerative agriculture, which is something I'm very much an advocate of, regenerative education and getting kids as much as possible out of the factory system, out of the industrialized, just like trying to move beyond industrialized farming. Because I look at the industrialized farming and you've got the cow or the sow in that narrow little confining space. They're fed hormones and antibiotics and all of that to keep them, from the diseases that they would be getting.
Kind of like middle schoolers in Atlanta.
Yes, it is. I mean, I look at that and I think of these kids in these schools, and I'm like, oh my God, the analogy here is quite appropriate.
You know what else you do to animals in the factory farming system? At least some of them. You chip them. You tag them,
sure.
And that's
well. Okay, so we were already
next up with the middle schoolers,
and we were already hearing stuff like that with the whole COVID phenomena.
Well, yeah, and it goes back before. I mean, it goes back to the late 90s.
Yeah,
the first human grade RFID chip, right, to be patented, that was 1997. And of course, that, in the lead up to the year 2000, people were really tripping out. I mean, you already had human implantable technologies going way back before that. But what you had there, in cattle, it had been used all over the place, right? The RFID chips, just an, radio frequency identification tag. You can just scan it, and this is this cow, that's that cow, this is this pig, that's that pig. the kind of glass encased RFID chip that was patented in '97. I think the first real rollout of it was 2004, and now I need to really update my information on this. But as of 2019. The company Dangerous Things, which sells these implants for people, which are injected not unlike a piercing. The gun looks much like a piercing gun, a piercing kind of contraption. There's a roughly 100 to 150,000 people or so, probably.
Really?
With this is just an estimate, right? But there are a lot of people across the planet, many tens of thousands, we can say safely, across the planet who have voluntarily taken the chip into their palm. Very popular examples in Sweden. And odd because people associate Sweden with like COVID freedom and whatnot, but Sweden's also the most atheistic, or among the most atheistic and irreligious populations on earth. So they don't have the kind of hang-ups with the mark of the beast sort of thing. And again, this is a little outdated, but so there's a company, Biohacks, another company called Epicenter. Both of them are involved in this sort of chipping fetish. And among the Swedes who've kind of gotten into this, they have this process called a cyborg birthday. Basically, the day you get your chip, that you've truly merged with the machine. And then from there, it's just this mundane thing. Oh, I would use my chip to pay for my train ticket, or use my chip for my groceries. Again, this is just thousands, right? Of a country of many, many more. This is a tiny minority. But you do wonder, in the same way that other technologies were at first like this kind of, avant-garde. There were just people who fetishize it, right? Whether it's a smartphone, a pager, even like, robots. I do wonder, like, if either through kind of conditioning, people could be more conditioned to be comfortable with the chip. In the case of kids, like in your middle school, right? Like the factory farming middle school down the road here. If the argument is made, and the argument has been made, right? This was an argument that was made in Klaus Schwab's Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's been made by many kind of pro-tech people. If there is a concern that your child could either go missing or be kidnapped, and if you could mitigate that risk by chipping your child, then would you not be a negligent parent for not chipping your child? And just like you would chip a dog.
Sure.
And I wonder, right now, again, it's just like this tiny minority, and most people are pretty freaked out by it and they don't want anything to do with it. But could a sufficient crisis, like with COVID, like with 9/11, whatever, could a sufficient crisis push the population to accept it in large numbers? I don't know.
We were hearing, mandatory vaccinations.
Yeah.
That was part of the whole narrative at the time. I don't know. There, my main concern there would be, well, okay, if you've got, let's say, a special needs child and you need to track, well, that's one thing. If it's simply intimately between the parents and their children, you bring in the government or some large corporation or something, now it's a whole different animal.
But it's in the case just of the chip, right? Just an RFID chip, basic RFID chip. You're not going to like make a homemade one, you know what I mean? More than likely. It's going to be something that is going to have to be a company that makes it for you.
I see. Yeah,
and you're going to need an infrastructure that makes it relevant, right? If nobody can scan it, if the ID doesn't mean anything in a larger system, then it doesn't have the same effect. Maybe, I don't know. I wonder. I remember in the late 90s, and it was a great time for apocalypse theorizing. But I remember in the late 90s, people just tripping out. Like the mark of the beast will be a chip in the hand, a barcode on the forehead. That was before brain implants was like really deep in the consciousness. And you'll have a mass digital system of surveillance that will control people like machines. And that will be the end of the world. By the year 2000, you will see it. It will be over, basically. And maybe people will be raptured, so on and so forth. 2000 came and went. But, what's weird is that the overall vision did come true. Post 9/11, you saw like a slight a very large shift in that direction. It wasn't as cosmic. It wasn't as cartoonish. There were not, locusts with scorpion tails and human faces flying around. But now you have drone swarms, and
Right.
they don't have human faces and scorpion tails, but on a kind of symbolic level, they sure do feel like that. This, you could riff on sort of apocalyptic themes all day long, but I do think that there's something to, even though the end has always been nigh, like in every generation, there's somebody screaming the end is nigh. In some generations, you have millions of people who believe that the end is nigh, and it never seems to get, it's always just around the corner. Never, thankfully, here we are. But I do think that sort of dark imagery, just like with Rudolf Steiner, just like with John of Patmos, just like with old Ted Kaczynski for all his flaws, that sense of that dark sense that maybe, just maybe, this technological system that we're building around ourselves or allowing to be built around ourselves isn't for our good. And maybe it's for our detriment. Anyway, I send the kids into the woods. Biophilia, 1,000%.
Yeah, send the kids.
Or to Merriweather Academy. My friend Warren is running a place called Merriweather Academy. Maybe you've heard of it.
We've been hearing about it, and I obviously want to hear more about it. So next time Warren and I get together, we're going to talk about that. And we've been proactively now starting to look at properties where some of these things, alternatives, can start manifesting. How long have we been going?
Hour and 40 minutes.
It's probably time to wrap it up. I mean, we could go for another hour, but we can always do this
again. Up to you, big dog. I'm just around the corner.
Yeah, so we can do this again if you're up for it.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think any concluding thoughts? I mean, there's so much we just didn't get into. I'm like, everything you're saying is triggering responses in my mind that we're just not going to get to go there. But yeah, so we should definitely do a follow-up conversation. I think there's more. I want to hear more about the new book you're writing, and any concluding thoughts that we want to, anything to just for people to take with them to think about. Let me plug your book. The book here is Dark Aeon. I haven't quite finished it. I got to 270 pages, and then I jumped forward to chapter 13 because you recommended I should read that. And look, you can see I've been defiling your book with highlights.
That's enhancement. That's
okay.
Yeah.
Show the book again.
Okay, so right here, this is Dark Aeon. Lower. Lower.
That's good right there.
Can I read a passage out of it?
Sure.
Okay. What remains, and this is page 383, what remains of our American Republic is being demolished and restructured by the titans of techno-capital and the global American empire. Its fractured shell is being repurposed by the lofty equality castes of globalism and late-stage liberal democracy, with hybrid techno-communism seeping into the cracks. The internet, once a spearhead of open inquiry and free speech, has become the most powerful platform for mass surveillance and mind control in human history. That gets a fist bump.